My name is John Fusatich, and I will be your instructor for this Module 1, which is entitled An Introduction to the Ethical Analysis of Conservation Values. This module comes in 3 lessons, and this is the first of the 3 lessons. I want to begin by offering some insights about the nature of ethics itself. I would like to do that by sharing with you a series of 4 common misperceptions that people have about ethics, and then antidotes to those misperceptions. The first misperception is that ethics is telling other people what to do. The antidote to this misperception is that ethics is understanding what we should do. That means that ethics has more to do with explaining ourselves to other people than it does with telling them how it is that they should behave. It also means that ethics is of greatest value to us in these cases where we're maybe not quite sure what's right or wrong for a particular case, or cases where we maybe have an intuition about what's right or wrong, but maybe don't know fully all the reasons why. If we approach a circumstance with that kind of attitude, that is the attitude that will allow ethics to do the most for us. This next misperception is that ethical problems are impossible to solve, and because they're impossible to solve, it's just not worth our effort to spend any time on those kinds of problems. The antidote to that misperception is to know that ethical development is certainly slow and laborious, but it's also very much worthwhile. I think a good example of this would be the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Some leaders of that movement did not live long enough to see the fruits of their labor, and thank goodness they didn't give up along the way, thinking that it was too laborious or that things were moving too slowly. The next misperception is that ethics is like social science. The antidote to this is to know that ethics is its own rigorous academic discipline from the humanities. And these two fields, ethics and social science, certainly have some important things in common. Both fields are interested in values and beliefs and behavior. But where they differ is that social science is interested in describing how we behave and describing what our beliefs are and explaining why it is that we behave the way we do and why it is that we hold the beliefs that we hold. By contrast, ethics is interested in asking the question how it is that we ought to behave and what values should we hold. So there's a difference between describing the way the world is and asking how the world ought to be. That's the difference between social science and ethics. We'll talk more about this throughout the semester, but for now this is a good starting spot. The last misperception that I want to discuss is that ethics is subjective and relativistic and religious. That means that you're allowed to believe what you want and I'm allowed to believe what I want, and there's just nothing more to say about it than that. It's maybe a little bit like chocolate ice cream. You can enjoy it and I can say I don't, and there's all there is. The antidote is to know that ethics is in fact rooted in logic, much more so than many people appreciate. And I'll begin to illustrate that point right now and through an idea that is referred to as an argument. An argument is a collection of statements, some of which are referred to as premises, one of which is referred to as a conclusion, and together they are referred to as an argument. The premises serve as evidence in support of the conclusion. And here we have a simple example. Premise number 1, all birds have wings. Premise number 2, robins are birds. And then the conclusion, therefore, robins have wings. It's a very simple argument, of course, and it's only intended to help us understand what an argument is. There is an entire category of argument that is referred to as an ethical argument. And here's an example. Premise 1, drunk driving endangers the lives of others. Premise 2, you should not endanger the lives of others. Conclusion, therefore, you should not drive drunk. What makes this an ethical argument, and what makes any ethical argument, is that its conclusion can be expressed in a particular way. It can be expressed in terms of the words we should behave in a certain way, or maybe we'd say we ought to behave in a certain way. If you can express the conclusion in those kinds of words, then we'll be dealing with an ethical argument. Now, ethical arguments have some interesting properties to know about. The first is that they almost always contain at least one ethical or one empirical premise, a premise that describes the way the world is. could be a factual claim, could be a scientific claim of some kind. Ethical arguments always contain at least one ethical premise. In this case, premise 2, you should not endanger the lives of others, is that ethical premise. And the ethical premise is an expression of some kind of a value. Now think for a moment about conservation. In particular, just ask yourself, well, what is conservation? What kind of an activity is it? When I say that I'm going to become a conservation professional, what is it that I plan to be doing? While you think of those kinds of questions, think about statements like this: we ought to conserve this water resource in this way, or we ought to conserve this forest resource in this particular way. It seems that conservation is very much about evaluating claims of this nature. Conservation seems to be very much about understanding how it is we ought to relate to various parts of the natural world around us. And you also know by now that statements of this nature, they are also conclusions to ethical arguments. And so it means that conservation is, whether we recognize it or not, is ethics in action. And a question we could ask ourselves is, I wonder what the argument is that lies beneath claims like the claims that we're looking at on this slide here. Anyway, so now you're starting to see a little bit about how it is that conservation and ethics have some important features in common. What I want to do now is just illustrate how it is that arguments in a somewhat formal sense can be brought to bear on topics of interest to conservation and conservation ethics. The first example is only meant to be an illustration. Premise number 1, driving less is good for the environment. Premise number 2, we ought to be good to the environment. And the conclusion is, therefore, we should drive less. This is not tremendously controversial. It's not full of deep insight. It just illustrates some points of connection between topics that are of interest in conservation and this idea of a formal argument. We can identify here, though, that there are the two types of premises that are required. Premise number 1 is intended to be an empirical claim about the nature of the world around us, and premise number 2 is intended to be an ethical claim. Let me give one more example. Premise 1, trophy hunting supports lion conservation. Premise 2, we ought to support lion conservation. Conclusion, therefore, we should support trophy hunting. Notice a couple of things. First, this argument also has a premise 1 which is intended to be an empirical claim about the nature of the world around us. Premise 2 is the ethical claim. This argument has exactly the same structure as the argument that we saw just a moment ago about driving less. While the argument about driving less seemed to be not very controversial and very straightforward, this one you might recognize as being a very controversial claim about whether it's a good idea to support trophy hunting of lions. And so at this point, it's appropriate to maybe scratch your head and wonder a little bit about this particular argument, and then to ask yourself, well, does the argument actually support the conclusion? And how could we know if it does? This brings us to the topic of argument analysis. What is so very important about arguments, in fact, what's very convenient about arguments, is that there are only two ways in which they can go wrong. And we can get at these two ways in which an argument could go wrong through two questions. One question is to ask, are any of the premises mistaken? And if there's a mistaken premise, then the conclusion, we'll say, is not supported by the argument. The second way in which an argument can go wrong has to do with its logical structure. We can ask of an argument, is the logical structure valid? If the answer is no, then we say that the conclusion is not supported. Let me give some examples of this. And I give examples that have nothing to do with ethics, just to make these two principles easier to understand. First example, premise number 1, all mammals give live birth. Premise number 2, the platypus does not give live birth. The conclusion is that the platypus is not a mammal. So this is clearly an argument. It's got premises that are intending to serve as evidence, and it has a conclusion. It turns out in this particular case, the logical structure is just fine. There's no trouble there. but it turns out that there's a mistaken premise. And the mistaken premise, which you might not have recognized right away, is premise number 1. And because premise number 1, it causes us, in this particular case, to arrive at a faulty conclusion because, of course, the platypus is indeed a mammal. Let me give another example. Premise number 1, all mammals have 4-chambered hearts. Premise number 2, eagles have 4-chambered hearts. The conclusion, eagles are mammals. In this case, both of the premises are perfectly true, but it turns out that the logical structure is faulty, and it's just simply not the case that eagles are mammals. Let's take a look at another example. It begins premise 1, we should promote economic development. Premise 2, child slavery promotes economic development. And then the conclusion is we should promote child slavery. Now I know that straight away when you see the conclusion you're just certain that the argument is wrong, but let's look at how and why it goes wrong, because that's where we'll gain the most insight here. Clearly it's an ethical argument because the conclusion has the word we should in it. Premise 1 is the ethical premise. Premise 2 is the empirical premise. We analyze all arguments in the same way, which is to ask those same questions. One is, are the premises true? If you don't mind, let's just take for granted that both of these premises are true. Because what I like to do is draw our attention on asking questions about whether the logic is valid. Because you could think that premise 1 and premise 2 are true and still be, obviously queasy about the nature of the conclusion. This business about asking whether the logic is valid, this is one of the more difficult parts about argument analysis. And one of the ways to get at logical structure is to ask questions about unstated premises. Sometimes you can reveal poor logic by recognizing that there's a missing premise that should be stated, and if it is stated, then things kind of fall into place, or at least we can make better sense of things. And the missing premise here would be we should do anything and everything that promotes economic development. We know that that premise is false. There are many things that we shouldn't do to promote economic development, but premise 3 is necessary for completing the logic. So we either have one choice or the other. One choice is to let the argument be like this, in which case we have a poor premise. Premise 3 is inappropriate, and then we can't support the conclusion. Or we can get rid of premise 3, but then we suffer from the fact that it's got poor logic. So this business of finding unstated premises is very important. The last small topic that we'll cover in this lesson has to do with a particular skill. It's the skill of converting text into an argument. And the reason that this skill is so tremendously important is because in our everyday lives we don't talk in arguments. We don't go around saying to each other, premise number 1, blah, 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 premise number 2, and so forth. Instead, we just speak in regular sentences and paragraphs. And we write in sentences and paragraphs. And so here's an example of just a short piece of text that somebody could utter about conservation. And that statement would be that nickel is a valuable resource. We should mine nickel in our local area because the technology to do so is safer now than it ever has been. We can convert that into an argument in the following way. The first premise in the argument is essentially just the first sentence, and that's pretty easy. The conclusion comes from being mindful of the second sentence of that statement. In the statement up above where it says we should mine nickel in our local area, that's the conclusion. Therefore, we should mine nickel. And then premise number 2 is that modern methods for mining nickel are safer than previous methods. The value of converting text into an argument is then it lets us clearly see what the conclusion is, to see what the supporting evidence would be, and then we can evaluate it in the same way that we would evaluate any claim about how it is that we ought to behave. We would evaluate it by asking, are there any mistaken premises, or is there a problem with the logical structure of the argument? And we will have some exercises this week as part of this module where we practice converting text into arguments. I think you'll find those exercises to be very much worthwhile and interesting. That's all that I have for now, and so stay tuned for Lesson 2 from Module 1.